Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the best case scenario for Democrats in this year's midterm elections for the Senate. And so right now the Democrats are doing better than ever nationwide. According to 538, they have a 57% chance at retaining control of the US Senate for the next 2 years and the second half of Biden's first term. And if you look at the national generic ballot numbers, Republicans are only up by a margin of 0.2%. So basically it is a statistical tie between both parties. So right now the lead that the GOP had over the last couple of months really has disappeared, and so that's why it is now a good time to look at hypothetically how well Democrats really could do if things continue to go well for them. And this of course is going to be a realistic scenario, so this is a possible scenario that can happen. I'm not just going to give Democrats random races here. This scenario is based off of all the data that we've seen over the last couple of months and how they would translate to a good election for Democrats. Alright, so starting off with the solid states, I'm actually going to give Democrats all of the solid states that you would traditionally categorize as being solid. Basically, these are the races that either party are virtually guaranteed to win, and basically we'll see margins of at least over 15% or around that margin in all of these states. Now, for the GOP, I'm not going to include the state of Utah. I think in a best case scenario for Democrats, Evan McMullin could get within 15%, so it is going to be a likely state on this map. Likely states are states that are going to vote for either party by around margins of 5 to 15%. So still, they may be relatively competitive, but not as competitive as a lean or tilt state. So with these solid states filled in, I have 42 seats for the Republicans and 45 for the Democrats. And now we're going to take a look at all of these individual races, these final 13 races that are going to decide the balance of power here in the Senate. And I'm going to start off with Nevada and look at the races going from left to right to make this a little bit more interesting. I'm not just going to go from likely to lean to tilt. So starting off with the state of Nevada, in a best case scenario, yes, Democrats would continue to hold this seat. Catherine Cortez Masto, first elected in 2016, is now running for her re-election against Adam Laxalt. Laxalt has been a very average candidate. He has not been that great at campaigning. He has not been that active on the campaign trail either. However, he is still running a pretty strong campaign overall. He's only down by a margin of 1.5%, and Adam Laxalt really is a viable candidate for the GOP. He is somebody that could win this race. However, with the tide turning in favor of the Democrats, it seems more and more difficult for the Republicans here, and Catherine Cortez Masto's 1.5% lead is actually much smaller than the average of all of the polls that we've received over the last 3 months. Polling here in Nevada really has not been that great for the GOP, and so right now this 1.5% lead is significant, and Democrats typically don't underperform too much compared to the polls, maybe around 1 to 2%, but still 1.5% is significant. And so if we are going to look at this map, if it were in a best case scenario for Democrats, Nevada would definitely be a lean Democratic state. Masta won by 2.4% in 2016. I think we can see a very similar margin here in 2022 as well. Moving on to the state of Utah, as I said before, Utah is going to be likely for the Republicans. Even in a best case scenario for Democrats, Evan McMullin has no chance at winning this race. Utah is still a very conservative state, and even though McMullin is a conservative independent, as the Republican incumbent Mike Lee has significant advantages in the state, and so even though he only leads by 9.6%, in all honesty, he's probably still going to win by a solid margin, just because independents almost always underperform. But in a best case scenario for Democrats, I really could see Utah being a likely state, with Evan McMullin being the independent candidate that the Utah Democratic Party has chosen to endorse. So Utah is going to be a state that the GOP is going to win no matter what, but the race could tighten up depending on how the national environment is. In Arizona, we finally know who Mark Kelly is going to be facing off against this November, and that, of course, is going to be Blake Masters. On the 2nd of August, Blake Masters narrowly won the Republican primary, defeating both Mark Brnovich and Jim Lamont. Both of these two candidates, however, both performed much better against Blake Masters in the polls against Mark Kelly. And yes, polls are not always right, but they typically are accurate when they show how well candidates are doing if they are of the same party. So if you look at these polls here, Jim Lamont was behind Kelly by margins of 10 and 14% according to the most recent poll. Masters was down by margins of 12 and 15%. If you look at a previous poll conducted by Future Majority, Kelly was up by 6% against Lamont and 9% against Masters. So in Arizona, we're seeing something like the nomination of Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, where the establishment who wanted Jim Lamont to be the nominee, they ended up losing very narrowly, with Blake Masters ending up on top. Same thing with Mehmet Oz defeating David McCormick by a very narrow margin in the Keystone State. So right now, Blake Masters Masters really is in trouble. I mean, if you look at all the polls released between him and Kelly, Mark Kelly is basically led by double-digit margins in all of these polls. I mean, look at a poll from all the way back in May. Mark Kelly led by a margin of 16%. The Republican Party is probably not going to flip Arizona this election cycle with Mark Kelly as a very popular incumbent, and I never base my predictions off of polls alone, but I mean, just looking at these numbers, it really would be difficult to see Republicans winning in a best case scenario for Democrats, and even if it wasn't a best case scenario for Democrats, I would still categorize Arizona as a lean Democratic state. In 2022, given the national environment, it still would be difficult for me to put Arizona as likely. I don't think Mark Kelly can win by a margin of over 5%, but definitely a margin of 1 to 5% is very possible for the Democratic incumbent. Next up, in Colorado, Michael Bennet is basically locked in for his race against Joe O'Dea. There's really no chance that Joe O'Dea ends up winning this seat. In 2016, Michael Bennet was reelected to a second term by a 5% margin, and I mean, in Colorado, this margin was not especially strong at all. If you look at the 2018 governor results, Jared Polis won by a solid margin, and of course, in 2020, Joe Biden won the state by a margin of 13.5%, and in 2020, on the Senate level, John Hickenlooper flipped Colorado against Cory Gardner by a margin of 9.3%. Of course, Gardner was the Republican incumbent, so it'll be very difficult here for Republicans to win this state. And in a best case scenario for Democrats, I do have Colorado as a likely Democratic state, the same rating that I give to them even if this was a normal scenario. I don't think Democrats can win Colorado by over 15%. Even Biden couldn't do it in a year like 2020. Bennett is definitely not going to do it in 2022, so Colorado is going to be a likely Democratic state. Now we're going to look at the two states west of the Mississippi that we have left, starting off with the race in Iowa between Chuck Grassley and Michael Franken. I've talked about this race quite a bit over the last couple of days. Chuck Grassley is going to face a pretty strong challenge from Michael Franken, probably the strongest one he's had over the last 4 decades, as Chuck Grassley is now running for his 8th term in office, and he would become the longest serving member of Congress, as Patrick Leahy is going to be retiring after this election cycle in early January of next year. So if you look at Chuck Grassley's 2016 margin, he won by a margin of 24%. In 2010, it was a margin of 31%, and all the way back in 2004, he won re-election to a 5th term by a margin of 42%. So Chuck Grassley's margins here in Iowa really have decreased significantly over the last couple of decades as he has been getting older, and his age in 2022 is going to be a big issue. If he wins this race and serves out the next 6 years until 2029, he would be closer to 100 than to 90, and so Michael Franken is doing pretty well in the polls right now. He's only down by 8% according to the 2 most recent polls, and one of them was even an A+ rated poll. So I think that a likely Ohio race is very possible, and of course, in a best case scenario for Democrats, it is almost definitely going to happen. So Iowa, I have as a likely state currently. I still, of course, believe that Chuck Grassley is going to win, but Michael Franken is going to get within 10% probably in a scenario like this. Now, in the state of Missouri, I'm going to call this as a likely state for the Republicans as well. However, the GOP did make a good choice here with their primary nominee. Of course, yesterday we also saw the nomination of Eric Schmidt as the Republican nominee. He did partially receive the endorsement of Donald Trump. Donald Trump endorsed Eric, which could have been Schmidt or Greitens, but Schmidt did end up coming out on top. He won by a pretty commanding margin over Vicky Hartzler and, of course, Eric Greitens. And Trudy Bush Valentine won the Democratic nomination against Lucas Kunce. And this race is not going to be that competitive in all honesty. Eric Schmidt may win by a solid margin, but in the end, Democrats are not going to stand a chance here. In a best case scenario for the Dems, though, I think the race can get within 15%. If you look at the most recent polls between Valentine and Schmidt, Schmidt only led by 6% in the most recent one. However, she only received 36% of the vote, so a third of the electorate was undecided or was supporting Wood, which is the independent candidate there. But if you look at the Survey USA poll from 3 months ago, Schmidt led by a margin of 13%, so he is polling very well. If Eric Greitens won the nomination, the Missouri race would be much, much closer. I would honestly categorize it maybe as a lean Republican state. At best, it would be likely. There would be no chance that Missouri would be solid if Greitens ended up winning the race, but of course, he lost to both Hartzler and Schmidt, which was pretty surprising, and so Valentine as the Democratic nominee, even though I think that Lucas Kunce would have been the better candidate, Trudy Valentine is going to be a pretty competitive one if the Democrats do well this year. So Missouri, I'm going to have as a likely Republican state on this map as well. Alright, and now we're going to look at the 3 races in the upper Midwest that we have left, and then New Hampshire, and then the final 3 races here in the Southeast. So starting off in Wisconsin, this is probably going to be my most controversial rating. I'm actually going to give this race to the Democrats. I think that there is a chance that Ron Johnson loses the re-election. Now, obviously, Ron Johnson is in a very good position in his race. He definitely is favored to win right now, and if I had to choose right now, I would definitely put my money on Johnson and his election to a 3rd term. Now, Ron Johnson is not popular in Wisconsin, and he is going to face off against Mandela Barnes, who is going to win the primary next week. Mandela Barnes is the current lieutenant governor of the state alongside Tony Evers, and if you look at the only poll released between Barnes and Johnson, Mandela Barnes does lead by a margin of 2%. However, in the end, this race is going to be very difficult for Democrats. I mean, Ron Johnson in 2016 was able to win his re-election by a margin of over 3%, despite it being expected that Russ Feingold was going to end up on top. And of course, 2016 was a very different year from the one that we have now in 2022. The state of Wisconsin has continued to shift to the right, and so Democrats are going to have more and more trouble in the state. And of course, with Russ Feingold no longer on the ballot, I think Democrats will actually do better this time around. But Wisconsin, I do still have as a lean Republican state normally. However, in this scenario where we have Democrats doing better than they typically would, I will categorize Wisconsin as a tilt Democratic state. I do think they can flip Wisconsin given the circumstances, and if this was not 2022, if Ron Johnson was running for re-election in 2020, I think a win here for Democrats would be very, very possible. And of course, Johnson's allegations that he was in a plot to overthrow the 2020 election results, that is not going to help him at all either in a state that voted for Joe Biden. In Ohio, I know that a lot of Tim Ryan supporters want me to put this state as a tilt Democratic state as well, but really I'm going to give it to the Republicans. I mean, looking at this race here, yes, J.D. Vance is a terrible nominee. If you compare him to Mehmet Oz and Herschel Walker, he really is not any better. He's probably one of the 3 worst nominees that the GOP has put up for an election this November. Tim Ryan is probably one of the better ones for the Democrats, and yes, he is quite an electable candidate in Ohio. He's won his House races for 2 decades in a swing district. However, the national environment in Ohio is probably going to be able to carry J.D. Vance by itself. If you look at the polls here, yes, Tim Ryan does lead by a margin of 2.1%, but basically all these polls are bad. That's basically the simplest way I could put it. If you look at all of these 7 polls that have shown Ryan ahead, yes, he is up by significant margins. However, 3 of them were funded by Democratic sponsors, and the other 3 were online polls conducted by SurveyMonkey. So I'm going to have to see much more accurate polls that show Tim Ryan leading by even larger margins if I want to categorize this state as a tilt one for the Democrats. If you look at the 2018 race, yes, Sherrod Brown was reelected to a 3rd term against Jim Renacci, but he only won by a margin of 6.4%. Now, if you look at the polling data for this race, I mean, Sherrod Brown basically led by double-digit margins in every single poll. The final poll conducted by Change Research had Brown up by 10 points. He only won by half that margin. So Democrats always underperform in Ohio. In the 2020 presidential election, Trump beat Biden by 10 times the margin that was expected. So in Ohio, I'm going to categorize it as a lean Republican state. I think that Tim Ryan can definitely make this race a 5% race in a best-case scenario for Democrats, but I do not think that he's going to be able to win, at least with the polls that we have right now. And also the fundraising numbers, yes, they're good for Democrats, but Democrats almost always do well in fundraising simply because they have more sponsors. And moving on to Pennsylvania, of course, you guys know that I'm going to categorize Pennsylvania as a flipper Democrats here on this map. Mehmet Oz right now is seriously failing as a GOP nominee. The Republican Party is very worried about this race because, of course, if Mehmet Oz loses, this would be a gain for the Democrats and would make the Democrats' chances at retaining Senate control much, much higher. So Mehmet Oz right now is down in the polls by a margin of 10%, and we've had a lot of new polls released. And the 3 new polls, they are online polls conducted by SurveyMonkey, and I will go over them in the next couple of days. I mean, there's just so much stuff to cover right now with the political landscape as it is, but John Fetterman has basically led by double-digit margins in many of the most recent polls, and this really just goes to show you how dominant the Democratic Party here is in this race. And so in a best-case scenario for Democrats, I do think Pennsylvania can go to Democrats by a margin of over 5%, simply because John Fetterman really is a very special nominee. He really is a very different politician, and something that I do think can defy the natural environment. So even though Democrats are going to underperform, yes, John Fetterman is not going to win by 10%. He won't even get close. I do think a 5% margin is within his reach in a best case scenario for Democrats. So this is actually going to be the 50th seat here that will go blue on our map. And we're left now with just 4 more races. So starting off with New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan is running for a second term after narrowly being elected in 2016. And so she is probably going to face off against Chuck Morris. I'm going to assume that Morris will end up winning the nomination. Hassan did do well in many of the older polls. However, the 2 most recent ones only show her up by 3%, and the other one actually has Morris up by 2. So Maggie Hassan is still in a pretty competitive race, and even in a best case scenario, I do think that New Hampshire is going to be a lean Democratic state. Now, obviously, this is going to be a realistic best case scenario, so I really could see this map occurring if the Democratic Party continues to do well nationwide. Now, Wisconsin may be a bit of a stretch, so I do have it as a tilt state. It could still very much go both ways, but Ron Johnson is still a particularly weak incumbent. Really, the only thing that's saving him is the fact that Wisconsin is becoming more conservative, and the year is 2022, when Joe Biden has a 35% approval rating. So in the state of New Hampshire, I'm going to categorize it as being lean Democratic. I do think Maggie Hassan is going to struggle. I mean, just compared to 2020, Jean Shaheen won her re-election by 15.6%, but New Hampshire is going to go with the Democrats nonetheless, and this means that according to this map, Democrats are actually going to expand their majority as they're now at 51 seats. In North Carolina, we have a very competitive race between Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd. None are the incumbent, as Richard Burr will not be seeking a 4th term. And so looking at the latest polls we've seen here, Ted Budd is up only by an average of 1%, and the most recent poll actually puts Beasley up by 2. And so if you do look at all of these recent polls, most of them have been funded by Republican super PACs or Republican sponsors, and so of course they would show Ted Budd ahead. However, Ted Budd is still doing much better than Tom Tillis in 2020, and of course, in that race, Tom Tillis still ended up winning, despite the polls looking like this. Every single poll going into this race showed Cal Cunningham ahead, but of course, he ended up losing by a margin of 1.7%. He actually did worse than Joe Biden. And so Democrats have been trying very hard to capture North Carolina on the Senate level, as well as on the presidential level over the last decade, and they have not been successful on the presidential level since Barack Obama's win by a margin of 0.3% against John McCain all the way back in 2008. Democrats did, however, win the governorship race here in 2017 with Roy Cooper, and he was reelected in 2021. So if you look at all of the most recent numbers here for 2022, though, Democrats are not doing as well as they were in 2020, and so basically as a result of that, they're probably not going to win North Carolina. Democrats are probably not going to be too enthusiastic about turning out. There really is no other major race in the state. So Ted Budd, I do have him winning with a lean margin, even in the best case scenario for Democrats. Even though North Carolina is not as red as Ohio, I think we may see similar races here in a best case scenario for the Dems, as of course J.D. Vance is a much weaker candidate than Ted Budd in North Carolina. Next up in Georgia, this is another race that I've really covered a lot over the last couple of weeks just because of how many developments we've seen from this race between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. I mean, with Walker still refusing to debate his opponent. And so Raphael Warnock is doing very well in this race. He is fundraising much better than Herschel Walker, I mean by tenfold. And in 2021, his race broke the record for the most amount of money raised for a Senate race. It was either his or John Ossoff's. It was basically 1-2 for those 2 Senate races. And so Raphael Warnock was the senator that basically gave the Democrats the majority in the Senate alongside Ossoff. And so in 2022, his seat will be very important for Democrats. And if they lose this race, their chances at winning the Senate go down dramatically, as of course right now Herschel Walker has proven to be a very weak nominee, just like Mehmet Oz and Blake Masters. And I'm not just going around saying this about all of the Republican candidates, but really their polling numbers have been surprisingly bad. If you look at the polls in Georgia, Warnock is up by 3%. And I mean, yes, you can argue that maybe polls are fake, polls are not always right, but Warnock leads by 3% in the Senate race. But if you look at the gubernatorial polls, Brian Kemp is up by 5%. So right now, on average, Herschel Walker is doing 8% worse than Brian Kemp. It is not Republicans that are doing poorly in Georgia, it is just Herschel Walker. So right now, I do expect Raphael Warnock to win his re-election. I think that as one of the strongest incumbents in the country, he is going to perform relatively well considering how purple of a state Georgia is and how long of a Republican history it has. Basically, all of the most recent polls released during the summer have shown Warnock ahead, and so on this map, I'm going to categorize Georgia as a lean Democratic state. Yes, this is the 52nd seat for the Dems, making it so that the Democratic Party is probably going to expand the majority by 2 seats in a best case scenario for the party. And finally, in Florida, we have the race between Marco Rubio and Val Demings. Val Demings, in all honesty, is not going to win this race. Marco Rubio is one of the more popular senators in the country, and he was easily reelected in 2016 against Patrick Murphy after winning his first race in 2010 against Charlie Crist. So in 2022, Marco Rubio is in a good position. I mean, just looking at how the governor race is going for Ron DeSantis, Republicans are not going to struggle too much in the typically close state of Florida. Of course, in 2016, the Senate and governor races were both tilt races for the GOP, but in 2022, as Florida has continued to shift to the right, Democrats are not going to make gains in this state. I mean, Florida was one of the only states that voted for Donald Trump by a larger margin in 2020 than in 2016. It was a 2-point shift to the right, which is pretty significant considering how close Florida usually is. And so if you look at the polls here between Rubio and Demings, I mean, Marco Rubio just blows Val Demings out of the water. He is going to win by a double-digit margin, even in a best-case scenario for Democrats, but I don't think the race is going to be solid for the GOP. I do think that Florida is still going to remain relatively competitive, and so this is going to be the final state on the map, 52-48, after we've taken a look at all of these competitive states. And so this is my 2022 Senate map based on a scenario in which Democrats continue to do better and better, and this would basically be a best case scenario for them. And I thought that it would be a good time to look at this as Democrats are trending upwards nationwide, with them only at a 0.2% deficit. And so I'm going to cover the August 2nd primaries in just a couple of days. I want to wait until we get more of those results out so that we can actually talk about the final results instead of speculating over who's going to end up winning those very close races, especially in Arizona, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below whether or not you agree with this map and which races you think are wrong according to these projections, even if it was a best case scenario for Democrats. Subscribe to my channel if you have not. Consider purchasing a channel membership for just 99 cents per month, and I will see you guys in the next video.